The Honourable Member Paul Goldsmith.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was half expecting the opposition to be talking about the mixed ownership bill, but he devoted half his speech to tax policy, which seemed to suggest that maybe they've moved on to the next thing. I can understand that this bill has generated a lot of passion, and I accept that there are many people who would prefer that the government retained full ownership of all our assets, and it's a natural urge to want to hold on to things and to resist change. But my sense, however, is that most people realise that the proposal here is a modest one, selling only a minority stakes in these companies. They know that this government is retaining majority control, and the mixed ownership will free up billions of dollars for investment elsewhere. They understand that governments can't keep piling on debt forever. They see the pickle that many European governments have got themselves into and support the government's determination to avoid that problem here in New Zealand. Britain right now is adopting drastic measures, reducing the public services by 700,000. Is that where we want to be doing? Certainly not. They probably wouldn't know that the Treasury's forecast in 2008, when National came into government, predicted government debt rising to 60% of GDP by 2026. This is before National came into government, so we hear Mr Parker saying that they reduced debt. Well, yes, they did, but they left this country pregnant with government spending promises and plans over the next couple of decades that would have taken us up to 60% of GDP by 2026. But they did know that the government spending was unsustainable, and they support this government's determination to bring our books back to surplus. And today, Treasury's forecast for government debt into 2026 is zero. And they know that this Prime Minister flagged the policy that we're talking about in this bill loudly and clearly before the election and since, and they trust this government's economic competence. Meantime, there is a group that has been implacably opposed to this bill, and we've heard plenty from them over the past few months. And it's true. Yes, during the extensive select committee process, we heard primarily from the opponents. Fortunately, we do not weigh submissions by the kilo, but how do you balance 100 submissions basically saying the same thing with one submission from the New Zealand Chamber of Commerce, for example, which represents 24,000 businesses around the country, 24,000 countries, and you listen to all of them. But just dealing with some of the recurring themes that we've heard from some of the critics, why would you sell something that is returning...
The member is referred twice now.
Quite right. My apologies, Mr. Speaker. We've heard a number of times that why would you sell something that's returning? Why would one sell something that is returning 10% or 18% to reduce borrowing of 4%, or some variation of the same theme? And the Greens have been pushing this line the hardest. Well, the Burl report that they refer to talks about a dividend yield on mixed ownership companies of 8% and a cost of government debt of 4%. Well, that's quite wrong. Actually, if you look at the historic facts, the dividend yield has been about 4%, not 8%, and the interest rate the government's borrowed has been 5.4%. So that does put a very different light on things. But Russell Norman and Mr Parker, they missed the point entirely. You wouldn't hear Mr Parker encouraging people to go out and borrow $100,000 from the bank in order to invest in shares. Even though that they might hope that the shares might return higher than what they're paying in the interest. But nobody would do that because they correctly factor in risk. If a company that an individual might invest in may send a better return, but they might not, and they actually might lose money. But one thing they know about bank borrowing is that you have to pay it regardless of what the return you've got on the investment, and that is what interest and investment is all about. So the other thing that has been striking through this process has been the element of, well, frankly, xenophobia in the opposition, particularly focusing on we don't want to be selling things to foreigners and we don't want the Chinese involved, and we've heard that, and we want to turn ourselves inward as a country. Well, look, I stand for an open economy, and this country has been built on foreign investment. We don't have to be afraid of it. This government has has made it very clear that there are very strict limits about who can buy numbers of shares, and it will be a majority New Zealand owned. But I don't think we need to be anti-foreigner in our attitude. And of course, the government, the opposition, has to accept that if they want to maintain capital investment in the economy without passing this bill, that they'll have to borrow more from overseas. And it always strikes me as odd they don't regard that as a problem, but in terms of having investment from overseas, that's not an issue. The alternative would be to borrow a lot more debt on fragile and volatile foreign markets at a time when other countries are struggling under too much debt. We've just seen the monetary policy statement today that there is a risk of a severe deterioration in the European area, and this could cause bank failures across Europe, and in the worst case scenario, international funding markets could become prohibitively expensive. So there's no guarantee that the cheap money that we can have access today will be available tomorrow, and that reinforces, I think, the logic of reducing our borrowing requirements, and that's why this government has been prudent in the way that it's going about these activities. There's also been some concern raised about removing this bill from the jurisdiction of the Official Information Act and Ombudsman Act. Doing so is entirely consistent with the way that Air New Zealand was arranged by the Labour Party not so long ago. And we must remember that these will be listed companies with substantial private ownership. They'll be operating in a fully competitive market. They will have electricity and gas complaints commissioners providing independent outlet for complaints. And all of these companies will be subject to the New Zealand stock market's continuous disclosure regime. Now, finally, another thing, one minority report that we've had from a select committee process states that on average privately owned electricity companies charge 12% more for electricity than publicly owned ones. Well, when we drill down to the figures, what do we find? We find that may have been the case in February 2012, but if we looked in August 2010, depends when you take your little snapshot. If you look at August 2010, Contact was actually the lowest priced retailer. That's the funny thing about markets, is things bob up and down, and sometimes one's got a special on, sometimes somebody else has got a special on. You can't take a little snapshot at one moment and claim great things from it. That's not a robust way of working out how prices are generated. And in response to some criticism of the process, it is worth reminding it that we went through a thorough select committee process through the Hawke's Fire. It was first reading on the 8th of March. After the finance and expenditure, we heard there were 1,490 submissions, 124 of which we heard in Wellington, Auckland and Christchurch. I listened to all of them. They were listened to in respect. There were lots of questions asked, and the Treasury provided plenty of information on all the requests that we heard. So where do we get to? Mr. Speaker, this is a very significant piece of legislation and part of the National Party's plan to deliver a strong and enduring economic growth. It will reduce our requirement for international debt, and in the meantime, another benefit, one of the primary benefits of this bill is that it will deepen New Zealand's capital markets, strengthening our ownership culture. And it's a policy that will boost New Zealand's stock market. It's a policy that will broaden the pool of investments for New Zealanders. And a primary benefit, as far as I can see, in the mixed ownership model is that it will bring disciplines of the private sector ownership to these companies. The market test generated by the stock market and the signal provided by the share price as to what is happening to the value of the company or its return on capital is likely to be more transparent, more accurate than any system in place to monitor a purely state-owned enterprise. And I have every expectation that these companies will thrive on the basis of this bill, and they will generate wealth for all New Zealanders and produce electricity and all the other things that these companies are producing in a more efficient manner. And as a result, we will have less debt, we'll have a stronger economy overall, and this is one piece of a very effective national government policy to bring this country through to a brighter future. And I recommend this bill to this House. Thank you very much.
Order. I call the Right Honourable